Welcome to our second virtual reading group on Hannah Arendt. My name is Richard Saltoun, founder of Richard Saltoun's Gallery, and today's event is scheduled in connection with our year-long series of exhibitions inspired by Arendt's 1968 publication, Between Past and Future. Today's discussion will focus on the book's first essay, entitled Tradition and the Modern Age. The essay has been used as the basis for the gallery's current exhibition, which is on view in London until the 26th of February. Whilst lockdown continues in the UK, you can experience the show through our website, and there's a virtual tour of the exhibition on the site. Today's session is being led by Roger Berkowitz, founder and director of the Hannah Arendt Centre for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. We are modelling these sessions off the Centre's official virtual reading groups, which I encourage you to check out, and more information can be found on their website. Roger is joined by a very special guest, Seyla Benhabib, Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at Yale University. I just saw that on Seyla's Wikipedia site, Wikipedia entry, it says that she traces her family history back to the 1492 expulsion of Jews from Spain. Seyla has written extensively on Hannah Arendt, and Roger will tell you more about that shortly. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I pass over to Roger.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and welcome everybody. It's really an honor to be here, and it's wonderful what Richard and his gallery is doing, having a year-long exhibition of spectacular artists dedicated to thinking with and against Hannah Arendt. It's an exciting endeavor, and I commend him and thank him for it. I'm thrilled that over the next 12 months we will have 8 more of these virtual reading groups where we talk with scholars and artists about Hannah Arendt. A few housekeeping matters. I'm asking all the panelists, so there's about 18 panelists with us, and then more people in the webinar. And I'm asking the panelists to introduce themselves in the chat so that people who join know who they are and who they're talking to. This is the second of our series. We had a great talk a few weeks ago with Lindsay Stonebridge, which is on the Saltoun Gallery website, and I encourage you to look that up as well if you missed it. So today, as Richard said, we're talking about the first substantive chapter in the book Between Past and Future, book of essays by Hannah Arendt that the show is based on. And I'm thrilled to have presenting this essay, Tradition and the Modern Age, really one of the true Arendt, not only experts, it's probably too mild a word, someone who's brought more insight and attention to Arendt than almost anyone in the world, Professor Seyla Benhabib. She's an emerita professor at Yale, just went emeritus, congratulations, this year. She's a senior research professor at Columbia Law School now. She's the author of numerous books, really amazing books. One of her most formative books for many of us in the world of Hannah Arendt is The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, which is a fantastic introduction to Arendt's work, if you're interested. And then last year, she published Exile, Statelessness, Migration, Playing Chess with History from Hannah Arendt to Isaiah Berlin, which is a really beautiful book about a number of exiles and migrants, including Hannah Arendt, and looking at their stories of exile and drawing lessons from them for the world. She and I did a wonderful podcast discussion about that book. I thought it was really wonderful talking to her, which you can find on the Arendt Centre website and podcast sites. But it's an honor to have you here, Seyla. And she's going to give about a 15-minute introduction to the essay. We'll have a short conversation, and then those of you who are participants can also ask questions by doing the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Take it away, Seyla.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be participating in this conversation. It's an unusual and very welcome public forum, and I'm really looking forward to our exchanges. I think Hannah Arendt would have approved this conversation about art, politics, and philosophy. These essays are, I think, some of the most beautiful writing that Hannah Arendt penned. We are coming increasingly to realize that she was not only a philosopher, but she was also a marvelous and very important essayist with quite a literary flair. And in my opinion, each of these essays are like gems. They have a quality of construction and organization that is really delightful to read. And she herself is aware of this dimension in her writing, and she uses various terms, exercises in political thought, essays, and at one point she analogizes her writing to a piece of music. In the preface, she says, in a piece of music, there is a major chord which starts off, and somehow this chord keeps coming back through the variations. And for her, the chord that keeps coming back in these essays is this break in tradition, and sometimes what she calls the gap in tradition. This is discussed more explicitly in the preface. So I want to spend just a few minutes before I look at tradition and the modern age at this concept of a break, a gap, what she is working with here. And there are two, one literary work and I think one artistic work that we can put Hannah Arendt in conversation with, and that she is in conversation with explicitly. One is the short story by Kafka called He, where Kafka tells the story of a man being pushed by the forces of the future and the past in the marvelous way, and is torn. Every time he moves towards the future, the past pulls him. Every time he moves toward, he goes back to the past, the future falls. And Arendt comments, well, the only way for him to possibly get rid of this tension is via a diagonal jump out of space and time. I mean, if you can visualize to yourself, and she gives here the image of a parabola in geometry, where you're sort of going back and forth, and then you try to jump out of it. But she says, this is not always possible, but it's a temptation when you are caught between past and future. Now, the second image I want to share with you, it may be known to some of you, is Walter Benjamin's famous commentary on Paul Klee's painting Angelus Novus. There is a big story behind this painting. Walter Benjamin was very honored to own it, and it came into Gershom Scholem's estate, and I believe it's now in the museum in Jerusalem, but I'm not quite sure about it. But in this painting, young Walter Benjamin has an important commentary on this in his thesis on the philosophy of history. This is the angel who is looking at the progression of history as a Hauffentürme, as a collection of ruins, and is at the same time is being pushed backwards by a wind from paradise. And Benjamin says, well, this is what we mean. This is what progress is. This is his wonderful interpretation. There is not much in the Paul Klee painting that would necessarily warrant this interpretation, but you can see again this tension between the past and the idea of progress, the future. And as we know, Arendt was a close friend of Walter Benjamin and edited some of his works. And I do believe that she herself was thinking about Benjamin's reflections on the concept of progress and history. Now, tradition and the modern age. It begins with with this amazing claim. Our tradition of political thought had its definite beginning in the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. I believe it came to a no less definite end in the theories of Karl Marx. What does Arendt mean by this beginning? The beginning in what sense? And for Arendt, the beginning is never just a chronological beginning. It's always an arche. It's a beginning that contains a principle within itself that moves forward toward the future, if you were. Now, in Plato's great work, The Republic, if we focus on that for a minute, we can see this tension between philosophy and politics that Arendt is trying to articulate and work with in this essay. The tension is this. For her, the temptation of the philosopher is always to turn away from the sordid affairs, everyday affairs of humanity. Okay, what fools these mortals be? And Plato, of course, was deeply disappointed and disillusioned by the polis because of the polis's condemnation of his teacher Socrates to death, a man whom Plato considered the wisest and perhaps one of the just men of the polis. And we know from Plato's biography that he was part of an aristocratic revolt against the institutions of the polis, and very much also was interested in Egypt. He knew something about Egyptian political structure. Now, the work that Plato produced in the Republic, what he calls A City in Words, is a complete negation of the political experience of the polis. It has, of course, a utopian quality, but Arendt is right in pointing out that its utopian quality is a denial of the experience of politics as the ancient Greeks knew it. And how does Plato achieve this? In the Republic, Plato abolishes the private family. Children are told that they are all born of the earth. Some children are bronze, others are silver, others are gold. All children of a particular generation are brothers and sisters. They are educated not by their birth mothers, but by the nurses dedicated to the goals of the polis. And these children are segregated into different functional occupational groups. Some become artisans made of bronze, others that are made of silver become the guardians, and a third group, about which there has always been a lot of discussion, become the philosopher, philosopher leaders, queens, or the philosopher kings. Now, Arendt comes back to Plato many times in her work. One of her commentaries on Plato is that Plato, in fact, confused techne, and praxis. That is to say, Plato conceived of the human city as an artifact that could be made. And he, in fact, denigrated the life of the political because of its possible injustices, its blindness, etc. But in this particular essay, what Arendt is concerned with is the tension between philosophy and politics, that the philosopher, in a way, leaves the city, the world of human affairs, retreats to the world of ideas, and yet comes back and reconstructs, makes an attempt to reconstruct the city. There are various discussions of Plato throughout the essay. It begins with Plato, and towards the end of the essay, there is a wonderful commentary on the parable of the cave, again, one of the most famous images of Western philosophy, where prisoners in a cave have a source of light at their back, and they're looking at the walls of the cave, and they see some shadows. One of these prisoners frees himself and moves up towards the light source and realizes that the shadows are created by the source, but the greatest source is, of course, the sun. And at that point, Plato develops also his vision of the sun, not only the source of life and truth, but also the sun as the eidos, the idea of the good, okay? The idea of the good and the unity, the good, the beautiful, and the true, which he develops in subsequent works. So here we see this double movement of in Plato of removing oneself from the world of politics and yet coming back to it in terms of wanting to reconstruct and rebuild it. Why then does Arendt say that this tradition that begins with the tension between politics and philosophy, and with the disdain sometimes that the philosopher feels towards the world of politics and its mistakes, why does Arendt think that this tradition ends with Karl Marx? This is the thesis of the essay. We now know that Arendt had a longer and more complicated relationship to the thought of Marx than we thought. It was very common in my graduate student days, a number of decades ago, to think that Arendt was simply an anti-Marxist, and to place Arendt in the coterie of thinkers like Karl Popper and others who were equally critical of Plato, in this group of a almost Cold War critic of the thought of Karl Marx. And I recall many discussions about her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, where in the third section, Soviet Marxism and Nazism are discussed as varieties of totalitarianism. And many people on the left, I think sometimes justifiably, took exception to this, what seemed like an equation. Arendt does not equate things. Arendt differentiates, and sometimes infuriatingly so. So I don't think the thesis of this section was that Soviet Marxism equals National Socialism. Not at all. She was talking about the emergence of a kind of totalizing politics that in effect eliminates certain distinctions of life on which the political must rest, such as between the private and the public, civil society and the political party movement, etc. Now, it seemed in this context that Arendt's statements about Marx were simply dismissive of Marx's work. And we find out now that in effect, Arendt throughout the 50s and the 60s comes back to Marx again and again. And one of the most interesting discussions in The Human Condition is her commentary on Marx's concept of labor. The gist of Arendt's critique of Marx is the following. She thinks that Marx is, along with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, one of the subverters of the Western tradition for replacing the claim of animal rationale, the human being as a rational animal, with the thesis of the animal laborans, that the human being is the laboring animal. But she makes herself a really interesting distinction in Marx's concept of labor that many have not noted. And she distinguishes, not in this article, but in The Human Condition, which preceded a series of essays, between labor and work, Arbeit und Werk. And she says the distinction between labor and work is present in almost, at least she says, all European languages, but probably also more than that. Now, this is extremely important because in Marx's own work, particularly in the work of the young Marx, Marx writes of labor, but really means work. And I think Arendt is one of the few thinkers to have gotten this distinction correctly. Why? What is this distinction? The distinction is that labor is a metabolismic activity, metabolismic process of activity with the external world. Housework is labor. Cooking is labor. Factory work, of course, we think of it as quintessential labor. Cleaning is labor. Labor is also the work of the sustenance, the care for the world that falls apart if we don't care for it. Work, and here think of art, because she's thinking of art as well. Work is a kind of labor where at the end of it, it does not consume itself, but a product, something objective remains, something objective is there. And when Marx talks about Arbeit in his early work, and he says the human being realizes himself in his work, he's not talking about the human being realizing himself in the drudgery of the everydayness or even in industrial labor. He has this paradigm in mind of the human person realizing, showing his capacities, externalizing his capacities, a Hegelian notion, in this work, okay? Now, for Marx, that's why labor, cum work, is a creative process. It's a process of humanization. It's a process of creativity. It's a process of the transformation of self and the world. Arendt's, I would say, important reflection on Marx, and I see now that I'm going way beyond my time, is that, in effect, paradoxically for Marx, the utopia of a communist society is one that has freed itself of the drudgery of labor. And she reflects upon this, and also upon the famous statement by Marx that in the future society, you will go fishing in the morning, hunting in the afternoon, and doing critical criticism in the evening. This is from the German ideology. So Arendt's comment is, where is politics? this is a life beyond the political or without the political. So for her, the overcoming of alienated labor, the society of the future in Marx seems to be a society of individual private leisure that has lost a sense of public happiness. And I will say two more words, two more sentences, and apologies for having taken longer than anticipated. She also, in this context, comments upon this theme of the disappearance of the state, where politics becomes the administration of things. In Marx scholarship, this is usually attributed to Engels and not taken all that seriously, but she says, no, no. Marx himself took this concept very seriously. Of the political, it becomes thematized as a process of a life of emancipation, but a life of emancipation towards a kind of privatized leisure. Yeah. I don't accept all this criticism of Marx. I think there is more to the idea of emancipation. There is justice, there is solidarity, but I shall leave that maybe for the discussion. I just try to give you a sense of why she makes this claim that the tradition that begins with Plato ends with Marx. So thank you for listening. I shall stop there.
Thank you very much, Seyla. I think you've done a very valuable service, because I think this idea of what is the tradition of the political thought that Arendt says has come to an end in Marx is a very hard thing to uncover. It's an essay, and I think it's wonderful how you talk about her as an essayistic writer. I think I said last week in our conversation that I think of her as an aphoristic writer. And I think there's a latest, just to try and, put some clarity on a very difficult topic, right? You said that the beginning of the tradition with Plato and others is Plato's turning away from the messy world, right? I don't know, my words, not yours. The world that is often unequal and unjust and full of oppression and simply not lasting in a more metaphysical sense. And in Plato's turn towards the ideas or the truth. And then the philosopher then turns again, a second periogoge, a second turn back to impose the truth on the world. And in many ways, the tradition, I think, if you tell me if this is how you read it, I think it's what you're saying. The tradition of the Western political thought is the tradition from Plato forward of intellectuals, political thinkers, seeking to impose some truth, some philosophy, some ideology on the world. And and as you said, I forget the words you used, but it was some sort of a tense process. And on the one hand, you have the world, on the other hand, you have ideas, and they're back and forth. And with Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, and I think for Arendt, most clearly with Marx, the world has lost in this battle, right? I mean, what we have is ideological thinkers. They're different ideologies, and that may be produced by material conditions, but they are ideologies. And there's a kind of science of history, a science of progress. And the world of these scientific ideas, these ideologies, dialectical materialism, whatever we want to call it, and thus the tension which has existed from Plato until Marx ends with Marx insofar as the world humans are not free. I mean, it's all a matter of the unfolding of scientific laws. And that the real challenge is that for Marx, who speaks so much about freedom, freedom is lost in the sense of the human freedom to actually impact the world, because it's just the human freedom to play out laws which are to be discovered out there. And just like we have a laboring utopia without labor, we have a free utopia without freedom. And it seems to me those are two of the sort of key arguments Arendt brings. Does that make, I'm in a way just trying in my words to say what you said, but trying to see if I've gotten it right.
Yes, but I'm not comfortable with the word ideology. The word ideology is, used usually. It came into existence with the French Revolution in a way. These thinkers, particularly, and I would say even Marx, as opposed to Marxism. Certainly, Plato is not an ideologue of any kind of political teaching. Neither is Aristotle. It is a vision of this, as he calls it, the city in speech. And this vision, this eidos, is not an ideology in that sense. It's not a doctrine. It's not a teaching. With Marx, I mean, there is this tremendous and, long discussion about the young Marx versus the old Marx, etc. And let me say something about this. Arendt does not seem to accept or is not conversant with the tradition of critical Marxism, beginning with the, Lukács and the Frankfurt School. Her reading of Marx in many ways goes back to what is called, orthodox Marxism, historical materialism, and dialectical materialism. Now, she, unlike these other schools, unlike the Frankfurt School, does not seem to think that it's necessary to distinguish between what had been referred to as the humanistic versus the scientistic Marx, okay? And, I'm not just an interpreter of Arendt. I think with Arendt against Arendt. And this other tradition of the critical theory of the Frankfurt School is the other pole of my intellectual existence. And I've always tried to bring them into some kind of a conversation. So when Arendt throws out claims like in Marx's work, freedom disappears, you just have to think and catch your breath for a second. And because the whole ideal of human emancipation is certainly an ideal of freedom. But I give Arendt justice in this one respect, and this will seem odd to us all, that in effect, Arendt's claim that the question of the political, freedom and the political, is under-theorized in Marxism. And because it is, that there is some relationship, this is her claim, some relationship between Marxian theory and the authoritarianism of experiments that have been undertaken in its name.
Yeah. We can come back to that if people have questions. I just want one other question for you that's not about Marx, because that can get a little bit technical, and that's fine. One of my favorite, as I said, I think of Arendt often as an aphoristic thinker. And one of my favorite lines or aphorisms in all of her writing is in this essay. It's on page 27 for those who are reading it in the books. And it's where she says, okay, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche were the end of tradition, but they were still marveling at the end of it and fighting against it. And the break of tradition, which is after, they're the end of it, but the actual break happens with the established fact of totalitarian domination. And what she says is, for those of us who are living now after the fact of totalitarian domination, when we look back at the tradition, when we look back at Marx and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Plato and Machiavelli and this whole tradition, we sort of understand that it no longer applies to us. We understand that the tradition has an ominous silence for us, she says. But the thunder of the eventual explosion has also drowned the preceding ominous silence that still answers us whenever we dare ask, not what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for? And this strikes me as one of the most insightful, to me, right and currently relevant lines in all of her work. It's very easy for us today to know we're fighting against all sorts of things, whether it's inequality or racism or injustice, or even the tradition or Catholicism or Judaism or whatever. But it's very hard on a public level for any of us to articulate what we're fighting for. And I'm just wondering what you make of this line of hers, this insight.
I think it's a deep one, because so many systems of belief at this present time are trembling in a way. Look at the crisis of liberalism. Look at the critique of liberalism, the claim that in effect, in becoming neoliberalism, liberalism has lost its soul, that it no longer, the high liberalism of Jack Rawls and Jürgen Habermas no longer seems to motivate or speak, to the sort of welfare status democracies of our time. In their place, what we have is the rise of a kind of authoritarianism, or what I call neo-fascism, which does not point forward, but which is a regressive ideology, okay? It's an ideology of a masculinity that is no longer viable. It is an ideology of white supremacy that history has thrown by the wayside. It is an ideology of struggle, of the exploitation of nature, which the ecologists, think of people like Bolsonaro, think of people like, Erdogan in Turkey. What do they stand for? An ethno-nationalism that is regressive, right? So in that sense, I think, alas, we are in this kind of intermezzo, but the militant or the political activist in me would say we have to make stronger what we are fighting for, precisely because so much seems to be at stake in the present. We cannot afford to give up ideology maybe, but our ideals not.
Yeah, that's great. And while Arendt often seems incredibly pessimistic, right? What are we fighting for? We can't know. One page later, right on page 28, she says, this fact may seem deplorable, but implicit in it is the great chance to look upon the past with eyes undistracted by any tradition, with a directness which has disappeared from Occidental reading and hearing ever since Roman civilization submitted to the authority of Greek thought. There's a chance for newness, a chance for something new. I don't know if she's ever confident that it will actually happen, but she holds out that chance. And that's one of the things I always love about her work.
In the new beginning, this is a principle in her work, isn't it? Yeah. Every human birth, she says, just maybe very romantic, is the beginning, of a potential. And I think the human world is not possible without this principle of the arche, the principle of the beginning. And certainly politics is only possible if we have faith that a beginning is possible, that we can make it different.
I think that's well said. So now we're going to open it up to our panelists. We have 18 panelists on here who Richard Saltoun has put together, and many of them are artists who are showing in this exhibit on Hannah Arendt. And any of you want to raise a hand, you can ask a question. Also, the people in the webinar, there's a lot of you. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A function, and I'll try and get to those as well. But can I turn it to any of the panelists here? Do any of you guys have comments or questions? I know this is a complicated essay, so it can be a very simple question. It can be, what did she mean on this page? And we'll try our best, or anything you have. Pauline.
Hi, I can see Sarah wanted to put her hand up first, so why don't you go first and I go after Sarah?
I'm sorry.
Mine's a very basic question. In terms of her wanting to bring so much together, in particular bringing Kierkegaard, Nietzsche and Marx together, I'd really like to know where this was first published. And in the scan I was given, it didn't say at the end where it was first published, because it seems to me the forum, especially the density of it, the forum in which it would first publish would be interesting. I'm sorry, that's not a very interesting question, but it's interesting for me.
I think actually now you have raised my curiosity as well. There is an early essay of hers that I think is a kind of precedent essay to this, that was published in 1946 in Partisan Review.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And I would, and that is the, Roger, do you remember the exact title?
Yeah, I can get it.
Philosophy, and and that Partisan Review essay, in one of its begins this theme of tradition and the modern age, but it's not the same essay. So I don't have a concrete answer for you. I can just point. So Roger, what did you find? You seem to be in your full library there. I'm only in my study here.
I'm just looking. So there is for those interested, there's this new book came out, which is the first, it's volume 6, but the first appearing volume of the new complete works of Hannah Arendt. Tradition in the Modern Age, she has like 7 or 8 different drafts of it, largely written in the 1950s, actually. Although there are earlier drafts about, so not 19, I think you might mean 56, not 46. But one's called Philosophy and Politics, the Problem of Action and Thought. And the others are mostly just called Tradition in the Modern Age, but I think they were published in the Partisan Review. Seyla is right about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say something about that, Sarah, which is the Partisan Review is a intellectual, but not an academic journal at that time.
I know. And I mean, it was very Trotskyist at one stage. And so I do think that counts.
I'm just, and all I'll say is, I this is one of the more difficult, and, a lot of Arendt's essays are not so filled with, having to know Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche pretty well. It's a difficult essay, and it is amazing that she published something like this in the Partisan Review and not some academic journal. It just reminds us what people were reading back in the 50s, generally educated people. That's how I like to think about that. Pauline, and then Vivian.
Hi, so it's a kind of comment, but also a question, because I'm very much interested in the discussion around about truths. And it seems to me that Arendt's truths can be kind of complicated and problematic in itself, because it seems to me that she wants to kind of combine an idealistic truth with a world truth. And it seems to me this idea about beginning and these options and these potentials and intentions can come from this new idealistic truth that's beyond the world, but also comes in and forms the world, and then it comes from the world and back into the idealistic notion of the truth. So can we talk a bit more about that kind of complex notion about Arendt's potentiality of a new truth, or truths?
The final essay in this volume returns to the question of truth. And I'm trying to answer your question without getting into scholasticism. There is a very controversial account of truth in politics in Arendt's writings. But I'm not sure that that's what you were concerned with. I think you were concerned with a more general sense of truth. Would it be okay if one said that you mean something that is right? Or are you using the concept of truth in a more specific way?
Latter.
Okay, and tell me more about that, because I just want to, okay, what's the more specific sense then?
So when Arendt talks about truth being problematic, because going back to the Marxist issue about the private home, the private land, and it's not being part of like a public space, a public arena, and it infringes the notion about the gap in freedom and in relation to emancipation. It seems to me that on one hand, she wants to go for a public truth, but we're not quite sure what that public truth is. So maybe to go for that public truth, we have to go beyond the world to some kind of idealistic notion about what the truth might be. And we have to explore that and explore the textuality of that. And then once we have that, then we have to come back to the world and translate that or disseminate that to the world, to make the world a better place in some way or another, to create a new beginning.
Okay, yes, now I understand you better. You're referring to this kind of dual movement that that she sees in the kind of philosophical reflection and then the coming back. Arendt says that truth in politics can sometimes be coercive. That is to say, truth can be fabricated. It can coerce because it is generated through precisely ideology or fabrication, a problem that we see in our time when we don't know the origin of truth. Very often between truth and verisimilitude, the image, its origin, all these concepts are in crisis in our time, right? In terms of our public culture, where on earth does something on the net originate? Does it matter to anybody? Who is that? But public truth, and I like that term, that it's not her term, but I think I like the term public truth because what she wants to say is that the truth of the philosopher, when it enters the public realm, must be subject to the conversation of individuals who are joined together in that public realm to create, to be in a polity, to create what Arendt would say, the common thing, the res publica, right? That which we share. So that public truth can never be top down. It is something that we must create together, even if the inspiration from it may come from a text we have read, an idea we have developed, but this concept of public truth is very much also part of the experience of public freedom. Okay, it has to stand. It has to be validated. And let me just say something here. You know. Arendt never wrote about John Stuart Mill. She should have, but you know, there is also a sense in which, in the liberal tradition, you know, the idea of in that Mill's that if you leave aside the so-called notion of marketplace of ideas, which got taken up by the US Supreme Court in a terrible decision, and which is a marketizing of free speech. But if you do think of a public forum of truth, and Mill was very right that in effect, truth is what must be able to sustain itself in the light of the public, in the public forum. Roger, do you want to come into?
You know, I think it was great. I mean, the only thing I'll add, and it's really just a footnote to what Seyla said, Pauline, is that Arendt makes a distinction between truth and opinion, or orthodoxy, orthos, the Greek word for the true, the measurable, and the doxa, the opinion of the many. And, you know, her vision of politics is founded upon a fundamental insight into what she calls plurality, that the world is plural and full of multiple opinions and plural opinions, and that there is no truth in politics. And I think that's one of Arendt's most important and most provocative insights in all of her writings. And that part of the challenge of the tradition of political philosophy, right, as Seyla has articulated here in the Arendtian sense, is that what political philosophy often does is try and take a truth and impose it upon the world. And as Seyla just said, when they do so, what Arendt reminds them is that when a philosopher brings their truth in the world, it's just another opinion. And that a lot of the anger about that people have against whether it's theorists or Marxists or any other ists or isms, is that there are these intellectuals who think they figured it out and they have some truth that they can bring onto the world. And then people say, hold on a second, that doesn't fit with the way I see the world. Why is your opinion more than mine? And Arendt's view is it's not. And that's the messiness of Arendtian politics. Vivian has a hand up, and then Tiffany.
Can you hear me?
Got it.
Okay, hi. I want to say, Professor Benhabib, it's such an honor to be even present in a conversation with you. And the only reason I'm speaking up, apart from being a loudmouth, is that I'm not a thinker, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a student of philosophy, and I'm a painter. And there are many things in tradition in the modern age in this essay that actually I relate to very personally as a painter. But first, I just wanted to say about Benjamin's Clay Angelus Novus and Arendt, you know, any, if I may say so, any representation of an angel would, for me, immediately, and not only for me, I think, refer to the angel of the Annunciation. And the angel of the Annunciation has many, many resonances also with, in Arendt's joy and fascination with the idea of the new, or in this case, it's always a sort of pretentiousness accompanying an idea of new, and the angel is always blown in by the wind to such an extent that you know, in many paintings you see that a candle might be extinguished there with the arrival of the angel. So, but because I'm not a student of philosophy, I sort of I plow through reading an essay like this very much like a puzzle, and the key is always language. I don't know Greek, but yet I seem to think, and I only say these things because I want to be corrected by you. I see that Hannah Arendt almost sometimes, in terms of her concepts and her ideas, thinks in Greek. So if I see that if one can understand actually the Greek word, and she often sort of explains it in a way, then it explains the concept, or might explain Otherwise, her difficult differentiations between, for example, labor and work, etc. And also because in other places she talks about work, and by which she means, you know, an artwork that has to endure and whatever. And in an essay where pretty much in every paragraph there's some kind of profound idea. If you read it in English, I think if you just read it as a story, it's almost prosaic, as opposed to, it's not poetical, it's almost prosaic, but yet in every paragraph there is a profound new idea. And the most prosaic sort of revelation for me here was, on the third page, I think, where, and this is so prosaic that she even puts it in round brackets. Thus, for instance, the shepherd could qualify for citizenship and the peasant could not. The painter, but not the sculptor, was still recognized as something more than Lavaros or whatever, which seems to be, is this right? It seems to be not just a brute, so not a laborer, not a toiler, but a brute in the sense of crude, as the French say, brut, or l'art brut. And here the distinction being drawn in either case simply by applying the criterion of effort and fatigue. So I feel that had I not come along 3,000 years later, I think the whole trajectory of my migrant life would have been affected by the fact that in ancient Athens, as opposed to in Cape Town in the 1970s, I would have been granted here a Greek citizenship, and then I never ever would have arrived in the United States of America, which was never part of the master plan and where I got to by default. But I think, and again, please correct me, am I right? A key here is, and this refers to Marx and where tradition ends in the writings of Marx, is something to do with the relationship of work, labor, and violence. So it has something to do with the fact that she also thinks that things break down, because in Marx, the revolution is fought through violent means, and this is in opposition to, the Greek persuasion, or the persuasion in the Greek polis, which is on a higher plane. And I don't want to ramble here. There's just so much. Am I making any sense here? Oh yeah, and then finally.
Let's see if Seyla can respond, Vivian. Is that all right?
Yes, but just finally, there's the thing of the sort of break, the rupture in the, because all of this in her lifetime, and looking back to the tradition from her lifetime, is from the point of after the advent and the catastrophe of World War I, as that ended everything. So thank you.
Vivian, there are so many dimensions to your comment. I would have liked to sit across the table from you with a glass of wine and chat. There are all these personal stories in and out of what you said. But going back to your first comment, as a painter, of course, you see things in that presentation of the angel, when the angel is doing that. It's a kind of almost of the wings of the angel, right? I have to pull up the image again and look carefully whether Clay is also drawing the wings, or if he is just simulating them. And thank you for pointing that out. Now, I think I'm going to beg to differ with you on the question of prosaic versus poetic. So much in Arendt strikes me as being poetic, maybe not the particular passage that you read about the many distinctions that the Greeks made, but and I don't want to just go into the game now of citation of texts, but she certainly has, in my opinion, a kind of poetic quality to her writing, and even in something like a text that is as dismal and as problematic and dealing with such difficult themes as the origins of totalitarianism. Look at the final discussion of solitude versus loneliness, etc. So I don't know. I mean, now this particular, the question of the Greek, I have a bit of a problem with this Penguin edition. I can read some ancient Greek, but I literally called up a friend who has a degree in Greek, and we had to go through some terms together. I don't know why there is not a glossary here. Whenever I've translated anything from German, I've always appended a glossary. So I have a problem here with my good friend Jerome Cohen and the Penguin edition. It's a little bit of a Zumutung, as the Germans say, that we would all know so much ancient Greek that we would be able to figure many of these terms out. I think that scholarship. But the larger question is, she has been accused of what somebody nastily called polis envy. Okay. And that, is it that, are we just rolling down the hill since the disappearance of the Greeks? Is that what's going on? I don't think so at all. I think that as for most German philosophers of that period, okay, of the period of the end, the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, you don't have ancient Greek in the texts of Jürgen Habermas, right? There is a break in tradition there. Habermas knows as much Greek and Latin, but he will not write philosophy by introducing this. Arendt is both, a student of that period, and also she learned philosophy first via Martin Heidegger. And she just made her own path and went through. But whenever she thinks about some of these fundamental philosophical concepts, it's her first teacher. What is admirable about her is that she really broke away from the antiquarianism, and she thought the modern world, right? It's just like the, origins of totalitarianism, on revolution, crises of the Republic. These are profound reflections on our condition. But it seems as if she has to begin there. I don't know, you're a painter, I'm a writer, I'm a philosopher. Sometimes, we all begin somewhere, and where you begin is often unconscious, It's just like I say to myself, why do I begin there? So
I find her so very close in a way to Nietzsche. He was, of course, such a genius philologist when he was very young. And do you think Arendt is, I feel that she's like a Nietzschean Marxist sometimes when she speaks about, a Nietzschean Marxist when she speaks about Marx. What do you make of her relationship with Nietzsche?
Do you want to do that, Seyla, or you want me to? So I'm going to answer this in a slightly acute way, which is that, as someone who happens to have the fortune and misfortune of running the Hannah Arendt Centre, I get almost every month something from somebody saying, I've just written the X that proves that Arendt was Y. She was a Nietzschean. She was a Machiavellian. She was a Platonist. She was an Augustinian. you know, she was a Greek. She the most important for her were the Romans. No, the first were the Americans. And you know, I think one of the reasons you get all this is because, and what Arendt says is that she reads all these people, and then she tries to think it through on her own. And I think that's what Seyla was getting at the end. She really does. She's not an antiquarian. She cares deeply about Nietzsche. She's influenced by a lot of what Nietzsche says, whether it's about nihilism or about revenge and other things. But in the end, you know, she is somewhat of a sui generis philosopher or thinker. And I think that's one of the rare and beautiful things about her.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, it would be more accurate to say that in this essay, she expresses her love for Nietzsche, her love.
And by the way, also her love for Marx and love for Kierkegaard. I mean, I think Seyla to be, I mean, I think Seyla and I have slightly different readings of Arendt and Marx, but I certainly agree with Seyla that Arendt loved Marx and read him very closely, and you know, I think quite well, but you know, with great love, and admiration. Yes. Tiffany, you've moved on the screen, but do you still have a hand up?
I just have a brief question. I mean, there was a line that just struck me, which was she said that violence is the midwife of history. And also she talks about, you know, thunder, this image of thunder drowning out the silence. And I just wanted to ask is violence always for her a catalyst for breaking the tradition for change? Is that even this image of the Kafka, and there's this fight going on, and then the philosopher comes out in the diagonal direction from fighting. It seems like violence is necessary to.
This is a quote from Marx.
Forward.
Yeah, this is a quote from Marx that Tiffany's quoting. It's on page 21, Seyla, in case you wanted to look at it. I'm happy to say something, but I'll let you start unless you want me to go first.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
You know, what I'll say about this, Tiffany, is that, you know, Arendt, in another of her essays on violence, she's arguing against the glorification of violence, which she actually says Marx doesn't glorify in that essay, whereas in this essay, she's actually saying he somewhat does. But what she says at the end of the first part of that essay is that their theory of history and change and social change, which says that there is no social change, there are no revolutions, there are no real meaningful changes without fighting, without violence. And Arendt, in many ways, her entire work stands against that claim. I mean, her whole work is about the fact, as Seyla said earlier, that in all human action, there's the possibility of beginning things anew, in starting things new. And while sometimes violence can help with that, more often than not, violence will actually lead to counter-violence and actually reaffirm the status quo more than changing things, but also that there are actions, human actions, that can bring about revolutionary changes that are not violent. And so this is a claim that Arendt, I think, really much of her work stands against, and she here attributes it to Marx, that violence is necessary to bring about a revolution. The idea that you need the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to get a bourgeois society to, you know, over the hump, as they say, to end up in a kind of communist utopia. Seyla, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. This is one of those passages in the text where she is saying, well, some of these quotes are attributed to Engels, but you can also find them in Marx, etc. This is an absolute simplification of Marx's view of history. And I don't know the exact quote, that the passage that she's referring to in the Heilige Familie, but there is the whole discussion about whether or not the contradictions of capitalism will lead to a violent revolution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a big political discussion within Marxist movements themselves. And I would not attribute it to Marx. If you really want to see Marx at work as a historian, the best works are the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and the Civil War France. He was a very talented social historian and would not settle for really simple-minded statements of this kind. But let me add one, I think, very important footnote. Arendt was she was an admirer of Rosa Luxemburg. Why is this important? And her husband was in the Luxemburgist faction. Rosa Luxemburg had this famous debate with Lenin about how to bring about social change. And Rosa Luxemburg believed in the building of a mass party. And he believed in the democratic participation of the working classes, and in establishing what subsequent theory has called hegemony. That's Gramsci's term. At the time, the debate, was with Lenin whether, in fact, one should intervene and one should have a party that led the revolution and intervened. So all of Arendt's commentaries on this question, and believe me, she knew this very well, because Heinrich Blücher, her husband, was immersed in these discussions and movements. So all of this commentary, in her case, is very much bound up with her own reflections on what happened to the various Marxist movements in her time, and why at the end Lenin won and then Stalin won, and Rosa Luxemburg was killed and thrown into the river in Berlin. Okay, so one has to take these things a little bit more in historical context.
Is that all right, Tiffany? I'm just going to read one question, Seyla, that came in from the chat, and then I see Margot has a question, and we'll end with Margot. There's a question from the chat that says, doesn't tradition have a double meaning in Arendt's thought? One referring to the tradition of political thought, the other to the declining role of tradition, that is, religion in shaping political discourse. Do you want to take a step?
I wrote to this person on the chat, and I said there is a sense of tradition as burden when it is an automatism or automatic obedience to the past. And there is tradition in the sense of what orients us toward the future through a thread of meaning. And what she's concerned with is what happens to tradition when this thread of meaning is torn, and when we only have the burden of the past, but not its capacity to fruitfully orient us towards the future.
Yeah, I think one of the sort of things that makes this essay a little tricky is that she's talking about, on the one hand, the tradition of political thought, and on the other hand, the tradition itself. And those aren't the same things. And we have to sometimes at least I have to constantly remind myself, which one is she talking about at any particular time? Margot, did you want to ask a question?
No, actually, I just wanted to make an observation, and we know that Hannah Arendt was keenly interested in current affairs when she was alive. And I've said more than once to Roger, oh, what would Hannah say now? It was reading this section along in the last 2 days, along with watching the trial in our Senate, the trial of the president. And it suddenly came to me that these 100 senators are forced to have to make their thinking comply with the document, our Constitution, which was an Enlightenment document for an agrarian society that is so long since passed. Well, maybe you could comment on that. I mean, we are stuck with some traditions, and I think this is a big problem for our political system now when so much has changed.
Yes. I sometimes shock law students. Unlike Roger, I'm not a lawyer by training, but I interpolate by quoting a phrase from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She commented somewhere that if, that the US Constitution is indeed an 18th century document, and that if one were to adopt a constitution today, she would adopt a Canadian one. I don't know why not the South African one. It's even more progressive, as far as I can tell. But this is serious comment by a serious jurist. I think a lot of people are aware of this issue, and my honorable colleague Bob Dahl wrote a little book called How Democratic is the American Constitution? The answer is not. It is a constitution that is trying to prevent majoritarian democracy by the federalist construction. It is the mixture of republicanism and some understanding of democracy, more civic republican than democratic. But Margot, the trouble right now seems to be that although there are many people thinking about, the various aspects of this constitution, and God knows if anything good can be said about, the last 2 or 3 months, is that we have all been forced to rethink some issues as the college of electors, must the elector vote her conscience, or the majority vote? Are there other ways? All these issues have come alive, but many of my colleagues at the law schools are now pointing out that if one were to have a constitutional convention, it would be hijacked by the right. And apparently there are some constitutional revision attempts being undertaken by various organizations and so on. And this is, I think that Arendt would cry, because, if you no longer have the guts to be able to revise a constitution, right? If you no longer have that moment, that possibility of a constitutional revision, you get very stuck. I mean, I still have some pragmatic faith and hope that maybe something can happen. But Roger, I know you think you've thought about this also. So what are your thoughts on this?
Arendt distinguishes different ways to understand what a constitution is, right? She doesn't think a constitution is in any way, at least fully understood as a written document that is sort of a kind of super or hyper law, which is how it's often, I think, understood by lawyers today. She talks about how constitution is from the verb to constitute, right? And that what's important about the United States Constitution is not the document, what it says. The actual document is important because it's a physical thing that is part of our tradition. But what's part of it is that in her reading, while Constitution has a long tradition going all the way back to Athens, the very idea that as soon as, the American Revolution started, all 13 colonies met and created constitutions. And she says 13 clocks beating as one. This idea that we live in a constitutional republic where the people not only have the right, but think they have the responsibility to get together and set out what are the basic propositions of how we're going to live together. That for her, that idea of constitutionalism, that we believe we have the right to constitute ourselves, was to her the radicalness and extraordinary insight or experience of what it meant to live in America in the 17th and 18th century. At least for people who had that ability to engage in those constitutional activities. And so one answer, one response, not answer to your question, or comment, Margot, is that for her, a constitution is this belief in one's right and responsibility to respond to constitute a government. Something that I think she would be embarrassed about how little is happening in that regard right now. She has 2 full chapters on the importance of the United States Constitution in her book on revolution. I think of her as one of the most important constitutional scholars in the world, although because what she says doesn't fit with what lawyers think of as the Constitution, she's not really widely read in law schools. But I've certainly written a lot about her constitutionalism. And at the core of it is not, for better or worse, the Bill of Rights plays a role in her constitutionalism, but it's really the structure. And what she thought was so brilliant about the structure of the United States Constitution was the absence of sovereignty, the fact that there was no sovereign place in the United States Constitution. She thinks that that's largely been eroded and that the president has become more and more of a sovereign. And she writes that in the final chapter of On Revolution. But her thinking about a non-sovereign constitutional republic in chapters 4 and 5 of On Revolution, I think is some of the most brilliant legal and constitutional thinking in the world that's ever been written. And I think she, in that regard, she thinks the US Constitution is special and unique in the world. Not for what it says in its Bill of Rights or other things, but in its structure of a federal republic. I'd at least point you in that direction.
I will only add there, remember Jefferson?
Mm-hmm. The tree of liberty?
No, not Jefferson. A republic, if you can keep it.
You can keep it. Yeah. I mean, for Arendt, I had this conversation with Masha Gessen the other day, which will be out soon, I hope. But, we were talking about, do institutions matter? And, we were saying, for Arendt, institutions matter. The Constitution matters, but not because having a Constitution will save us. It's something that, we have to keep it. We have to work at it. We have to constantly reconstitute ourselves. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that lawyers and, also the political elite have made is increasingly presenting the Constitution to people and to themselves as a document that has to be preserved in some sort of rigor mortis, and I don't think that's what it is at all in an Arendtian sense. Seyla, you want to? We're going to end. So if you want to have any final words or thoughts, I'll leave it to you.
No, thank you. All this has been a very, very pleasurable conversation, and I really enjoyed it, and I join you in these final thoughts, and I do hope that Arendtian hope about politics at the world at large. We certainly need a lot of Arendtian courage at the present moment. But I look forward to visiting the exhibit. I haven't done so yet, and I will. And Richard is saying something. Yes.
I just want to thank you very much. Another great talk. Thank you very much.
Richard, is the exhibit going to be open soon, or can you give people a quick? I mean, I know COVID is wreaking havoc with us all, but can you give us an update on when people can visit the exhibit?
No, of course not.
Okay.
Of course I can't. Of course not. Let's not worry about it. As long as we can do little events like this.
There is a virtual tour on the website that I recommend. Thank you, Seyla. This was wonderful. It's always great to talk to you. Thank you, all the panelists. Thanks, Richard.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Our next meeting is March 10th, where we'll be talking about the next essay, The Concept of History. So look forward to seeing you back on March 10th.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks,
Thank you.
Seyla. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.